The thought comes back for the 11th time before midnight. You catch it mid-sentence, slam a mental door on it, and reach for your phone to drown it out with anything else you can find. 40 seconds later it is back, sitting exactly where you left it, slightly louder than before. You have read the articles. Someone, somewhere, told you to just let it go, to surrender, to stop fighting so hard. You tried. You sat there waiting for some quiet shift to arrive, some loosening you could feel happening in real time, and it never came in any way you could point to and trust. So you went back to the only tool you had left. Push harder. Tell the thought no. Tell the craving no. Tell the fear no. And no matter how much force you put behind that no, the thing you are pushing against keeps pushing back with more weight than you gave it in the first place. Here is the part nobody explained to you. There is a real, documented reason why fighting an unwanted thought, a craving or a fear head-on, makes it stronger, discovered decades ago in a psychology lab by accident, during an experiment that had nothing to do with anxiety or willpower at all. And there is a complete, repeatable practice built directly on that mechanism. Not a mantra you repeat until you feel different. Not a leap of faith in some cosmic principle you either believe in or you don't. A method. One you can test tonight, on whatever thought shows up uninvited the next time you try to fall asleep. The instinct telling you to fight harder is the same instinct keeping the thing alive. That sentence will not make sense yet, and it is not supposed to. By the end of this audiobook, you will understand exactly why your mind works this way, and you will carry the entire practice that turns it around, starting with the very next thought you try to push away. Introduction. The Cost of the Fight. Why Willpower Backfires. This is a Top Audiobooks original. What you are about to hear was not built from a single opinion. It comes from decades of research in cognitive psychology, including the actual laboratory experiments behind thought suppression, joined with findings from clinical psychology on the practice of psychological acceptance. It is brought together here with one purpose: to change what happens the next time an unwanted thought, craving, or fear knocks on your door, starting tonight, not at some vague point in the future. Get a pen and a piece of paper now, not the Notes app on your phone. An actual page. Writing by hand forces your brain to slow down and process what it hears instead of letting it pass through unused, the way most listening does. Skip this step, and most of what follows will be gone by the time you wake up tomorrow morning. Somewhere along the way, you picked up a piece of advice that sounds true and explains nothing. Surrender. Let go. Stop resisting. The words get repeated in comment sections and yoga studios and self-help videos, as if saying them enough times makes them work. But nobody behind those words ever tells you what is actually happening inside your head when you try it, or why it works for some thoughts and seems to do nothing for others. You are left holding a technique with no mechanism, and a technique with no mechanism is just a guess dressed up as wisdom. This audiobook exists to close that gap, not with another encouragement to relax, but with the actual psychological finding behind why direct resistance backfires, the exact moment researchers caught it happening in a lab, and the complete method built on top of that finding, one you can use on a craving at 9 p.m., a fear before a meeting, or a thought that will not stop circling at 2 a.m. 3 distinctions will carry the entire structure of what follows. Suppression is not the same as acceptance, and the difference is not philosophical. It is mechanical. Resistance is not the same as redirection, and only one of them can actually be won. Mystical surrender is not the same as what we will call mechanical non-resistance, a specific repeatable technique that works whether or not you believe in anything beyond it. It does not matter which version of this war you are currently losing. Maybe it is a thought that loops at the worst possible hour. Maybe it is a craving that gets louder the moment you decide tonight is the night you finally say no to it. Maybe it is a fear that shows up right before you have to speak, perform, or simply walk into a room. Underneath the surface differences, all three run on the same circuitry, respond to the same kind of pressure, and weaken under the same kind of release. That is not a coincidence, and it is not a metaphor. It is the actual finding this audiobook is built around, and you will see it demonstrated, not just asserted, before the first chapter ends. Most advice on this subject treats the mind like a stubborn child that needs more discipline. Push harder. Want it more. Try again with more conviction this time. What almost nobody tells you is that the part of your brain responsible for monitoring whether you are successfully avoiding a thought has to keep that thought active in order to check on it, which means the very act of trying not to think about something requires thinking about it, repeatedly, just to confirm you are still not thinking about it. You have not been failing at willpower. You have been using a tool that was never built for this job, against an opponent that gets stronger every time you swing at it directly. What changes everything is not effort. It is direction. The thought, the craving, and the fear are not defeated by being attacked. They are starved by being correctly ignored. And there is a precise difference between ignoring something on purpose, in a way that works, and the kind of ignoring most people attempt, which is really just resistance wearing a calmer mask. That difference is where the next chapter begins, and it begins with the exact moment a researcher accidentally proved all of this in a lab. The pattern you are living right now has a name, a documented cause, and a complete fix. None of it requires faith. All of it requires noticing the next 10 minutes of your own mind, with the pen already in your hand. Chapter 1. The Checking Trap. Why trying not to think about it means thinking about it. It is 2 weeks since you put out your last cigarette, and your hand still drifts toward your jacket pocket on its own, the way a tongue keeps checking a missing tooth. You catch the motion halfway, fold your fingers into a fist, and tell yourself, clearly and deliberately, I am not thinking about this. Your jaw tightens. Your mouth goes dry. Your eyes find the clock. 40 seconds pass, and you are thinking about it more than you were before your hand ever moved. This is not a failure of resolve. It is a mechanism, and it has a name precise enough to point to: the checking trap. The moment you decide a thought, a craving, or a fear is off limits, some part of your mind takes on a new, exhausting job, standing guard at the door of that exact thought, ready to slam it shut the instant it tries to slip back in. A guard cannot watch a door without watching the door. To enforce the rule, do not think about the cigarette, your brain has to keep a working copy of the cigarette loaded and ready, just to check it against everything else crossing your mind. The ban and the thing being banned are now welded together, and pulling on the leash only tightens it. The same trap closes around an anxious thought before a meeting, a craving for something sweet at 11 at night, a fear you tell yourself has no business showing up again. The setting changes. The mechanism does not. You sit across from someone at dinner, nodding at whatever they are saying, while a private guard inside your skull stands watch over the one sentence you told yourself you would not replay tonight. And the guard's vigilance is the only reason that sentence never quite leaves the room. Live inside this trap long enough and it stops being about one craving or one anxious thought. It becomes the default setting of your nervous system. Every uncomfortable thing you decide is forbidden, gets a permanent guard posted at its door, and you spend years running security detail for thoughts and urges that a calmer mind would have let pass through and dissolve on their own in under a minute. The exhaustion does not arrive as one dramatic moment. It shows up later, quietly, as a sense that some background part of you is always working, always watching, and never actually off duty. And as a private suspicion, never said out loud, that your own willpower must simply be weaker than everyone else's. In 1987, a researcher named Daniel Wegner ran an experiment with nothing to do with cravings or anxiety on paper. He asked a group of people to do one simple thing for 5 minutes. Do not think about a white bear.
Whenever the white bear came to mind anyway, ring a small bell on the table in front of them. The bell rang constantly, more than once a minute for most participants, which already told Wegner something. But the real finding showed up after the timer stopped. When the group was told they could now think about anything they wanted, including the white bear. They thought about the white bear far more in the following minutes than a separate group who had never been told to suppress it in the first place. The ban had not simply failed. It had manufactured a rebound, a kind of mental hangover where the forbidden thought came back louder and more frequently once the leash was removed. Wegner named the underlying mechanism ironic process theory, though inside this audiobook we will give it a simpler name: the white bear effect. The description fits like a key turning in a lock. The part of the mind responsible for checking whether you are thinking about the white bear is, by its own job description, thinking about the white bear. Suppression does not remove a thought from circulation. It assigns that thought a permanent monitor, and the monitor's only function is to keep noticing the exact thing you are trying to stop noticing. This is the actual machinery behind the checking trap from a few minutes ago. The same machinery running underneath the hand that keeps drifting toward your jacket pocket 2 weeks after your last cigarette. So consider the uncomfortable question sitting underneath every piece of advice you have ever received about willpower. If telling yourself to stop thinking about something is precisely what guarantees you keep thinking about it, what exactly has all of that advice been asking you to do? Here is the first distinction worth keeping, because the rest of this audiobook is built on top of it. Suppression is not the same as acceptance. Suppression spends energy forcing a thought, a craving, or a fear away, and the white bear effect shows exactly why that energy reliably brings the target back stronger and more often. Acceptance lets the thought sit there, fully present, unchallenged, without assigning it a guard at all. And that absence of resistance is what paradoxically loosens its grip instead of tightening it. Suppression is what has been failing you for 2 weeks. Acceptance is the half of the equation almost nobody explains with any real mechanism attached to it, the part usually wrapped in vague talk about surrender and letting go, as if saying the words were the same as knowing what to do with your hands at 9 at night. This is the actual shape of what people mean when they talk about the surrender paradox. Fighting an unwanted thought directly is the one move guaranteed to keep it alive, while a specific, correctly executed kind of non-resistance is what actually starves it. Not surrender as a leap of faith. Surrender as a mechanism, with a hinge you can find and use tonight. Here is exactly what to do instead, in 3 steps, none of which requires you to believe in anything beyond your own nervous system. Step 1. Name it without banning it. When the urge, the thought, or the fear arrives, say its actual name in your head, plainly, the way you would describe it to someone else. This is the urge for a cigarette. Not stop, not no, not get out of my head, all of which are commands that recruit the same monitor responsible for the rebound. Naming replaces denial with observation, and observation does not require a guard. This is close to what the clinical psychologist Stephen Hayes built an entire approach around: acceptance and commitment therapy, which treats an unwanted thought as something to notice and hold loosely rather than something to defeat. Hayes found that people who practiced this kind of acceptance suffered measurably less from a thought than people trained to argue with it, even when the thought itself never changed at all. Step 2. Let it sit for a fixed window, not forever. Pick a real, countable boundary. 90 seconds is enough to start. You are not banning the thought, and you are not obeying it either. You let it exist in full, without fighting it and without acting on it. For a span you can count down in your head like a timer running on a stove. This is the step most people skip, because sitting with discomfort on purpose feels like losing, even though it is the only part of the sequence actually doing the work of unhooking the monitor. Step 3. Redirect attention to a specific physical anchor the moment the window closes. Not the vague instruction to think about something else. which leaves the door wide open for the original thought to slide right back through. An actual anchor, the exact pressure of your feet against the floor, the precise sound coming from the room behind you, the particular weight of the object currently in your hand. Redirection only works when the anchor is concrete enough to genuinely occupy attention, because a vague anchor gives the monitor nothing solid to hold on to instead, and it simply drifts back to its old post. Notice that this third step is not the same move dressed up in nicer language. Resistance is not the same as redirection, and the difference decides whether you win or lose before you even start. Resistance fights the thought head-on. In a contest, it cannot win directly, because the fighting itself is what keeps the monitor staffed and alert. Redirection never enters that fight at all. It does not argue with the thought, deny the thought, or order the thought to leave. It simply moves your attention to something else entirely, on a schedule you control, and the original thought loses its fuel supply on its own, the way a fire goes out once nobody is feeding it new wood. You are not overpowering the urge for a cigarette. You are quietly walking away from the only thing keeping it burning. This is the seed of what the rest of this audiobook will build out fully as the redirection practice, and you already hold its complete first cycle, usable tonight, not in some later chapter. Picture your hand drifting toward the jacket pocket again tonight. Instead of the clenched fist and the silent command, you say plainly, inside your own head, "This is the urge for a cigarette." You count, deliberately, to 90, neither fighting the urge nor feeding it, watching it the way you would watch weather move across a window. At 90, you press your palm flat against the desk in front of you and notice, specifically, the exact temperature of the wood under your skin, the small grain of it under your fingertips. The urge has not vanished in some dramatic flash, and it does not need to. It has simply lost the fuel that a guard was feeding it for 2 straight weeks. That is the entire cycle, start to finish, and it works whether or not you believe surrender is a spiritual principle worth trusting, because it was never asking you to believe anything. It was asking you to stop assigning a guard. Ask yourself, honestly, how many guards you are paying for right now, at this exact moment, for thoughts that would have dissolved on their own years ago if nobody had ever told them they were forbidden. Pause now. Write down 3 moments from the last week where you caught yourself inside the checking trap, forcing a thought, a craving, or a fear out of your mind through sheer command. Do not write what you wish you had done differently. Write only what actually happened, with the same flat accuracy a stranger watching from across the room would use, including exactly what your hands were doing at the time. You were never losing this fight because you lacked willpower. You were losing it because no one had ever told you the door does not need a guard, only a different place for your attention to stand. Chapter 2. The Smoke Detector. Proper problem. Why your mind treats a thought like a threat. You sent the email 4 minutes ago, and you have already reread it 11 times. There is a typo in the second line, the kind no one would notice on a normal day, and your stomach drops a little further each time your eyes pass over it. You open the sent folder again. You close it. You open it again. Your shoulders climb toward your ears. Your breathing goes shallow, and somewhere underneath all of it, a single sentence keeps looping. They are going to think you are careless. Nothing in that email was actually dangerous. Nobody is coming to your door. And yet your body is running the exact same program it would run if you had heard footsteps behind you on an empty street. Full alert, narrowed focus, a low current of dread running through your chest. This is the anatomy underneath the checking trap from a few minutes ago. The part that explains why a guard gets posted in the first place. The smoke detector setting. Your nervous system did not evolve to be accurate. It evolved to be cheap to ignore and expensive to miss. A smoke detector that goes off every time you make toast is annoying, but it costs you 30 seconds and a wave of your hand at the alarm. A smoke detector that stays silent during an actual fire costs you everything. Evolution built your threat system on the same logic, tuned to flag anything ambiguous as dangerous rather than risk missing something real, which means an awkward email, an unfinished argument, a craving you have decided to resist, and an actual physical threat all get filed into the same urgent folder, processed by the same alarm at the same volume. Live with this setting unexamined for long enough, and the trap does not stay the same size. It grows. Every time the alarm fires and nothing bad happens, your system does not conclude the alarm was unnecessary. It concludes the alarm worked, the way a person who wears a lucky charm to every exam credits the charm rather than the studying. Each false alarm that ends in nothing becomes proof, to the part of your brain doing the filing, that the alarm should keep firing just as loudly next time. And the list of things tagged as dangerous quietly gets longer every year you go without telling it otherwise. This is why the pattern rarely stays confined to the thing that started it. The cigarette craving from the last chapter did not begin as a craving about cigarettes specifically. It began as a single, ordinary moment of discomfort that got filed under danger instead of under simply unpleasant. And once filed there, it earned the same emergency handling as everything else in that folder. An email typo gets filed next to it. An awkward sentence from 3 years ago gets filed next to that. By the time you notice the pattern clearly enough to give it a name, the folder is no longer about one event. It is a standing policy, quietly running underneath everything you do, deciding in advance which ordinary moments of your day deserve a full-body alarm before you have even had a chance to look at them clearly. The instinct here is to argue your way out of it. Tell yourself it is not a big deal. Tell yourself nobody is even going to notice the typo. Tell yourself you are overreacting. None of this fails because the logic is wrong. It fails because logic was never the department handling the alarm. You are sending a memo to the accounting office about a fire happening in the kitchen, and the kitchen does not have a mailbox. Psychologist Susan Nolan Hoeksema spent decades studying what people actually do in the minutes and hours after a thought like this fires, and she found that the response itself determines how long the alarm stays lit. People who responded by replaying the moment over and over, turning it from every angle without ever landing on an action, what she called rumination, stayed distressed measurably longer, and recovered more slowly than people who responded with active reflection, a more deliberate look at the situation, aimed at actually resolving it or accepting it as resolved. The thought was identical in both groups. The outcome was not. Rumination does not investigate the fire. It just keeps walking back into the kitchen to check if it is still burning, which is its own kind of checking trap, running on the same circuitry you met in the last chapter. This matters because most people, told their alarm is oversensitive, respond by ruminating about the alarm itself. They lie awake reviewing every detail of the email, the typo, the tone of the sentence, the exact words the recipient might use in response, mistaking the sheer volume of attention for productive problem solving. It feels like vigilance. It functions like fuel. Every additional pass over the same 5 seconds of memory tells the smoke detector setting that this particular event deserved that much attention, which is precisely the feedback that keeps the threshold exactly where it is, or nudges it lower for next time. So here is the uncomfortable part. The fact that you have survived every one of these alarms so far is not evidence the alarms were necessary. It is only evidence that the system never had a reason to learn otherwise, because nobody ever told it the difference between an actual fire and a piece of burnt toast. That difference has a name, and it is the second distinction this audiobook needs you to hold on to. Threat is not the same as discomfort. A threat is something that can genuinely damage you, your safety, your relationships, your future, and it requires action. Discomfort is unpleasant, sometimes intensely so, but it carries no real capacity to harm you on its own. And left alone, it resolves the way any sensation does when nothing is actually feeding it. The typo in your email is uncomfortable. It is not by any honest measure a threat. The smoke detector setting cannot tell these two apart by itself. It was never built to. That distinguishing has to be done on purpose, by you, every single time the alarm goes off. Or the system keeps defaulting to the only category it knows how to apply at full volume. Here is the recalibration, in 3 steps, and it slots directly in front of the redirection practice from the last chapter, not behind it. Step 1. The instant the alarm fires, ask one factual question before doing anything else. Is this happening right now, in this room, to my actual body? Or is this a memory, a prediction, or a guess about what someone else is thinking? The typo in an email you sent 4 minutes ago is not a fire in the kitchen. It is a memory you are replaying, and a prediction you are running about a future conversation that has not happened. Naming which one it is takes less than 2 seconds, and already starts pulling the alarm down from full volume. Step 2. Downgrade the label out loud, in your head or under your breath, with a specific sentence rather than a vague reassurance. This is discomfort, not danger. Not, it's fine, which is too soft to compete with an alarm, and not, stop worrying, which is a command and recruits the exact monitor from the checking trap. The sentence has to name the category correctly, because the smoke detector setting responds to accurate relabeling, the way it does not respond to denial. Step 3. Once the alarm has been correctly downgraded, run the redirection practice from the previous chapter exactly as before. Name the thought plainly. Let it sit, unchallenged, for a fixed window. Redirect attention to a specific physical anchor the moment that window closes. The reason this step belongs after the downgrade and not before it is simple. Redirection only works cleanly once the system has stopped insisting there is an actual fire. Try to redirect attention away from a thought your body still believes is dangerous, and the alarm will simply override the redirection and pull your focus straight back, the way a real fire alarm cannot be redirected away from with a deep breath and a change of scenery. Think of these 3 steps as one continuous motion rather than 3 separate decisions. The factual question opens a small gap between the event and your reaction to it. The downgrade fills that gap with an accurate label instead of an empty reassurance. Only then does the redirection practice have clean ground to work from, attention with nowhere false left to cling to. Skip the first 2 steps and jump straight to redirection, and you will find yourself fighting the same uphill battle as before, trying to walk away from a fire your own body insists is still burning. Picture the email again. The moment your stomach drops on the 11th reread, you ask the factual question first. Is this happening right now? It is not. It is a memory and a guess about a reaction that has not occurred yet, and may never occur at all. You downgrade it plainly. This is discomfort, not danger. Then you name it. This is the worry about the email. Let it sit for 90 seconds without checking the sent folder again, and redirect to the weight of your own hands resting on the desk in front of you. The typo is still there. Nobody has responded yet. But the alarm that was running your whole body a minute ago has nothing left to feed on, because you told it, correctly and specifically, exactly what kind of event it was looking at. Notice what almost happened back there, in the gap before you asked the factual question. Your hand was already reaching for your phone to check the sent folder one more time, the same reflex as pressing a smoke detector's test button. Not because there is a fire, but because pressing it is the only thing that has ever made the sound stop for a few seconds before it starts again on its own. Pause now. Write down 3 alarms that went off for you this week, however small they seem written down in daylight. For each one, write what actually tipped you off, that it was a false alarm rather than a real threat, and write it in plain factual language, the way an inspector would describe what they found and did not find at the scene. You do not have a broken alarm. You have an accurate one, set to a sensitivity built for a world that no longer matches the one you are actually living in, and the fix was never to rip it off the wall. It was only ever to teach it, deliberately, what counts as smoke. Chapter 3. The Redirection Practice. Why writing it down finishes what redirecting started. You are standing outside the conference room 4 minutes before the performance review, and your palms are slick against the folder you are holding. Your throat has gone tight in that specific way it does, right before you have to speak in front of someone whose opinion of you matters. Your mind keeps running the same loop over and over, in a voice that sounds almost soothing. I'll be fine, this is going to be fine. That sentence is not as harmless as it sounds. Every time you repeat it, some part of you is quietly checking whether it worked yet, scanning your own chest for proof that the fear has actually gone down, the same way you might check a wound to see if it has stopped bleeding. It has a name worth giving it directly: the reassurance loop. Reassurance feels gentler than the flat command to stop being afraid, but it runs on the exact same circuitry as the checking trap from the first chapter. You cannot verify that a fear has been successfully calmed without first locating the fear, and locating it again and again on a loop keeps the alarm exactly as active as if you had never tried to soothe it at all. This is why people who are otherwise calm, capable, and prepared still walk into the room shaking, despite having rehearsed reassuring words to themselves the entire way there. The words were never the problem. The structure underneath them was. Reassurance, said enough times without resolving anything, becomes its own quiet ritual of fear maintenance, a habit indistinguishable in the body from worry itself, dressed in calmer language so it slips past your notice. The same loop runs before a wedding toast, before a first date, before a phone call you have been putting off for 3 days. The setting changes. The soothing sentence changes its wording slightly, but the underlying script stays identical. Repeat reassurance. Check whether it landed. Notice it has not quite landed. Repeat the reassurance again, slightly louder this time, as though volume were the missing ingredient rather than structure. Left unaddressed across enough performance reviews, enough toasts, enough difficult conversations, this pattern becomes the default response to anything that makes your chest tighten before you walk into a room. The fear itself starts to matter less than the exhausting script that automatically plays underneath it. The one telling you, on a loop, that you need to keep checking how afraid you still are before you are allowed to feel ready. And the checking itself becomes a second, quieter source of exhaustion that has nothing to do with the original review, toast, or call at all. There is a second reason reassurance alone cannot do the job, and it has nothing to do with the words you choose. Fear is not only a thought. The moment your nervous system tags a situation as threatening, in this case, an evaluation of your competence, in front of someone with power over your career, your body releases a fast chemical response designed by evolution to prepare you to fight or flee an actual physical danger, a mechanism the physiologist Walter Cannon first described over a century ago. Your heart rate climbs. Blood moves away from your stomach and toward your limbs. Your hands turn slick before you have consciously decided to be nervous at all. You cannot out-argue a body that has already been flooded this way. Telling a racing heart that everything is fine is like shouting instructions at a car already sliding on ice, technically true, beside the point the body is currently occupied with. This is the uncomfortable gap underneath most advice about managing nerves. It addresses the thought and ignores the chemistry, then wonders why the thought alone never seems to land. Ask yourself how many times you have repeated a calming phrase to yourself, sincerely, and felt your pulse climb anyway, as if your own body had quietly stopped listening to the meeting being held in your head. It had. The chemical wave triggered by an evaluation does not check in with your internal monologue before deciding how fast your heart should beat. It runs on its own schedule, a few minutes from peak to fade, regardless of what you happen to be telling yourself during that window. Left alone, with nothing new added to keep it going, that wave genuinely does fade on its own. This is the part reassurance accidentally interferes with without meaning to. Each fresh round of "I'll be fine" is itself a small jolt of attention back onto the threat. A tiny restart button pressed on a process that was already most of the way through running its course. The chemistry is not the enemy here. It was never going to last long by itself. The enemy is the habit of repeatedly checking in on it before it gets the chance to finish. So here is the distinction that finally separates what actually works from what only sounds like it should. Reassurance is not the same as redirection. Reassurance argues with the fear directly, trying to talk it down, which means staying focused on the fear the entire time you are supposedly calming it. Redirection never argues with anything. It does not try to convince your racing heart of anything at all. It simply moves your attention to something specific and physical, lets the chemical wave run its own course in the background, and gets out of the way of a process your body already knows how to finish on its own, usually within a few minutes, if nothing keeps re-triggering it. This is also where the two previous chapters finally meet. The checking trap explained why fighting a feeling keeps it alive. The smoke detector setting explained why your body tags an evaluation as dangerous in the first place, even though nothing physically threatens you in that hallway. Reassurance sits at the exact intersection of both problems, fighting a feeling your body has already classified as an emergency, using only words, which is roughly the equivalent of trying to put out a fire with a memo. Here, fully assembled for the first time, is the redirection practice, the complete technique, with all four of its parts named in the order you actually use them. Part 1. The threat check. The instant you notice your chest tighten or your palms go damp, ask the factual question from the last chapter. Is this an actual physical danger to me right now? Or is this an evaluation, a memory, or a prediction? Standing outside a conference room is not a physical threat. It is an evaluation your body has mistakenly filed in the emergency folder. And naming that out loud, even silently, starts pulling the volume down before you take another step. Part 2. The name. State plainly, in your head, exactly what is happening. This is fear about the performance review, not "I'll be fine," which is reassurance wearing the costume of calm, and not a flat denial either. A name stated once accurately, with no instruction attached to it, and no demand that it change anything yet. Part 3. The sit and redirect. Let the fear exist fully for a short counted window, without arguing with it and without feeding it further attention. 90 seconds is still the right length to start with, counted the same deliberate way as before. When the window closes, redirect attention to one specific physical anchor, the texture of the folder under your fingers, the exact temperature of the door handle you are about to turn, the particular sound of the air conditioning in the hallway, anything concrete enough to actually hold your focus instead of the racing thoughts underneath it. Part 4. The right. This is the piece that finally locks the other three into place. And it is the same ritual you were asked to begin this audiobook with, pen already in hand. The moment you have a free minute, before or after the moment passes, write 1 or 2 sentences naming exactly what the fear was about and exactly which anchor you redirected to. Psychologist James Pennebaker spent decades documenting what happens when people put a difficult experience into a small number of written sentences shortly after it occurs, and found it measurably eases the emotional charge attached to that experience over the following days, even when nothing about the situation itself has changed. Writing the redirection down does for the practice what redirection alone cannot finish by itself. It tells your nervous system, in a format it can actually file and retain, that this particular alarm has already been handled, so it does not need to keep raising the same one tomorrow morning over a meeting that already happened. Thinking the same sentence in your head does not produce the same effect, and the difference is worth understanding rather than taking on faith. Writing forces a level of specificity that a passing thought rarely reaches on its own, the exact wording, the exact anchor, committed to a fixed external record instead of left floating in the same loose place where the original fear lived. A thought can be revised, doubted, and replayed indefinitely. A sentence on paper is finished the moment the pen lifts, and your nervous system treats finished differently than it treats unresolved. Picture the hallway again. Your palms are damp, your throat is tight. You ask the question, "This is an evaluation, not a physical threat." You name it. This is fear about the performance review. You let it sit for 90 seconds, not arguing, not pretending it has already passed, and redirect to the cool metal of the door handle under your hand. The review happens. It goes the way these things usually go, neither perfect nor catastrophic. The moment you are back at your desk afterward, you stop for 30 seconds and write one line on actual paper. Today, fear about the review, redirected to the door handle, and it worked. 4 parts, each one complete, each one doing a job none of the other 3 can do alone. Pause now, even if nothing is frightening you at this exact moment. Write down one recent time you used reassurance instead of redirection. Name what you said to yourself, and name what a physical anchor in that same moment could have been instead. So the next time your palms go damp, the 4 parts are already familiar enough to reach for without thinking. You were never missing willpower, and you were never missing the right words to say to yourself in that hallway. You were missing the 4th part of a sequence that only becomes a practice once you write down that it happened. Chapter 4. The All or Nothing Trap. Why Partial Relief Feels Like Proof. It failed. It is 11 at night, and you are lying in bed, running the redirection practice on the same thought that has been looping since dinner. You ask the question, "This is not happening right now. It is a memory." You name it. You count to 90, not fighting it, not feeding it, and redirect to the weight of the blanket against your legs. 90 seconds end. The thought is still there. Quieter, maybe, a little farther back in the room than it was, but still there, and a second voice rises up immediately behind it, flat and certain. "This isn't working, you're still thinking about it. Just go back to fighting it the way you always have." That second voice is not reporting a fact about the technique. It is applying a rule, uninspected and inherited from somewhere long before tonight, that says any result short of complete and immediate silence counts as total failure. Psychologists call this kind of rule all or nothing thinking, and it has a particular talent for showing up exactly at the moment a new approach is having its first, modest, perfectly normal partial success. Notice what the rule actually demands. Not improvement. Not a thought that has gotten measurably quieter in 90 seconds, which is itself a real and rare result. Complete silence immediately, or the entire attempt gets filed as proof the method does not work for you specifically. A verdict delivered with far more confidence than 90 seconds of evidence could possibly support. This rule rarely limits itself to thoughts at night. It shows up the first time a diet allows one indulgence and gets declared ruined. It shows up the first time a difficult conversation goes better but not perfectly, and gets remembered as a disaster. Anywhere a result lands between 0 and total success, the rule throws out the actual data and replaces it with the nearest available extreme, usually the worse one, because disappointment feels more honest to the part of you that has been burned by hope before. The voice rarely announces itself as a rule being applied. It arrives dressed as plain common sense, the tone of someone simply reporting what happened without exaggeration. That disguise is exactly what makes it so effective at shutting things down before they have a chance to compound. A rule that openly admitted it was demanding perfection on the first try would be easy to argue with. A rule that sounds like quiet, weary realism rarely gets argued with at all. Left in charge long enough, this rule does something worse than judge one bedtime attempt harshly. It quietly trains you to abandon working methods at the exact moment they would have started compounding, then return to whatever felt familiar before, mistaking familiarity for effectiveness simply because it never asked anything difficult of you in the first place. What makes this especially costly is timing. The redirection practice, like most things that genuinely change how your nervous system handles a thought, tends to compound rather than fix anything in one pass. A small reduction tonight, repeated across a dozen nights, adds up to a different baseline by the end of the month. The same way a small daily deposit becomes a meaningful balance, only because nobody withdraws it the moment it looks unimpressive on day one. The all-or-nothing rule specifically targets day one, judging the smallest, earliest, least dramatic part of the process, as though it were the entire verdict, and walking away exactly when the compounding was about to begin. Here is what makes this rule so difficult to catch in the moment, even for someone who has heard of it before and believes they would recognize it. It does not feel like a thinking error. It feels like honest disappointment, the reasonable conclusion of someone who tried a thing and watched it not fully deliver. Nobody experiences all-or-nothing thinking as a distortion while it is happening. They experience it as simply seeing clearly, finally, after getting their hopes up. The psychologist Albert Bandura spent much of his career studying something closely related. What determines whether someone keeps trying a new approach after an early result that falls short of perfect? He found that people's belief in their own capability to execute a behavior, what he called self-efficacy, predicted persistence far more reliably than the actual outcome of any single attempt did. Two people can get the identical result, a thought that quiets by half in 90 seconds, and one person reads it as early proof the method is working, while the other reads the exact same result as proof they personally cannot do this, and only one of those two people tries again tomorrow night. Bandura's research also pointed to where that belief comes from, and it is rarely the outcome itself. It comes from how the outcome gets narrated afterward in the small private sentence someone tells themselves the moment the attempt ends. "The 8 became a 5 tonight" is a sentence about evidence. "I knew this wouldn't work for me" is a sentence about identity, delivered with exactly the same set of facts sitting underneath it. Only one of those two sentences leaves room for a second attempt tomorrow. The interpretation, in other words, is doing almost all of the work. And the interpretation is not fixed. It is a habit, learned the same way any other habit gets learned, through repetition. And it can be retrained the same way, starting with the very next time a result lands somewhere short of perfect. Ask yourself how many genuinely useful tools you might have already abandoned in your life. Not because they failed, but because they only partially succeeded on the first try. And a rule somewhere insisted partial success counts as none at all. So here is the distinction this chapter needs you to hold on to. Fading is not the same as vanishing. Vanishing means a thought, a craving, or a fear disappears in full, all at once, which almost nothing in your nervous system actually does, no matter how skilled you become. Fading means the intensity drops, measurably, over a counted window, while the thought itself may still be technically present at a lower volume. The redirection practice was built to produce fading reliably from the very first attempt. It was never built to produce instant vanishing, and judging it against a standard it never promised is not honesty. It is the same checking trap from the first chapter, now aimed at the method itself instead of at the original thought. Disarming this resistance takes 3 moves, and the first one happens before you ever start the redirection practice at all. Move 1. Set the correct target in advance. Before you begin, say to yourself plainly what you are actually expecting. Not silence. A reduction. If the intensity drops at all in 90 seconds, even slightly, that counts as the method working exactly as designed. Setting this target before you start removes the all-or-nothing rule's only foothold, because there is no gap left between what you expected and what actually happened. A rule that demands perfection only has power when perfection was quietly assumed to be the goal in the first place. Move 2. When the critical voice shows up afterward, declaring the attempt a failure, do not argue with it and do not obey it. Run the redirection practice on the voice itself. Name it specifically. This is the all-or-nothing thought. Telling me partial relief means total failure. Let it sit for its own short window, unchallenged, the same way you would let any other thought sit. Then redirect attention away from the verdict and back to whatever you were actually doing before it interrupted. The critical voice is not a special category of thought immune to this practice. It is exactly the same kind of event, and it responds to exactly the same handling, regardless of how official or final it sounds when it arrives. Move 3. Replace the verdict with a measurement. Instead of asking yourself the unanswerable question, "Did it work?" ask a question with a real number attached to it. On a scale of 1 to 10, how intense was the thought before you started? And how intense was it 90 seconds later? Write both numbers down in the same notebook the introduction asked you to pick up. An 8 dropping to a 6 is not a failure waiting to be diagnosed. It is 40% less weight than you were carrying 90 seconds ago, and 40%, repeated every night for 2 weeks, becomes a different person living a measurably different relationship with the thought, even though no single night ever felt dramatic while it was happening. These 3 moves work together, not separately. The target you set in advance prevents the gap that creates disappointment. The redirection you aim at the critical voice itself stops that disappointment from hardening into a verdict. The number you write down afterward gives you a record that argues back, on its own, the next time the voice tries to claim nothing happened at all. None of this requires you to feel optimistic in the moment, which matters because demanding optimism on top of everything else would simply be the all-or-nothing rule sneaking back in through a different door. You do not need to believe the method is working while you are lying there at 11 at night. You only need to run the 3 moves and let the number on the page make the case later, when you are calm enough to actually read it. Picture the bedroom again. The thought is quieter but present after your first 90 seconds, and the familiar voice arrives on schedule. This isn't working. This time, you name the voice instead of obeying it. This is the all-or-nothing thought. You let it sit for its own 90 seconds. Then you pick up the pen on the nightstand and write 2 numbers, an 8 before, a 5 after. You did not banish the thought tonight. You took nearly half its weight off in a minute and a half, with nothing but attention and a number. And the voice telling you that does not count has nothing left to argue with except the math you just wrote down in your own handwriting. Pause now. Write down 1 recent attempt at change you abandoned after a single partial result. Name the verdict the all-or-nothing voice delivered at the time, and write what the honest, graded version of that same result would have looked like as a number, instead of a judgment. You were never failing at the method. You were grading a partial, perfectly normal first result against a standard the method never claimed to meet. And the grading was the only thing standing between you and a second attempt.
Chapter 5. The Speed Gap. Why the Practice Breaks Down. When you don't have 90 seconds. You are 3 sentences into a project update when a colleague cuts in front of everyone on the call, and credits your idea to himself as casually as if he were reading the weather. Heat rises up your neck before you have even finished hearing the sentence. Your jaw sets. Your hand, already moving toward the unmute button, is half a second from a reply you have not actually composed yet, and 12 people are waiting to see what you do next. There is no 90 seconds here. There is no quiet bedroom, no private minute at your desk afterward. There is a live conversation moving forward in real time, and the gap between the moment your body decided this was an emergency and the moment you are expected to respond is shorter than the time it takes to read this sentence out loud. Call it the speed gap, the distance between how fast a threat response fires and how slowly any deliberate technique, including the one this audiobook has been teaching you, normally unfolds. The same gap opens in a dozen other settings that have nothing to do with conference calls. A stranger's comment on the street, a partner's offhand remark that lands wrong at exactly the wrong moment, a driver who cuts you off 2 seconds before you need to merge. None of these situations send you an advance notice or wait politely while you locate your notebook and count to 90.
They arrive already moving, and they expect a response before you have had any real chance to think. This is the exact moment people conclude the whole approach was never built for real situations. It worked fine, lying in bed with a notebook nearby. It falls apart the second an actual person is sitting across from you, waiting, with real consequences attached to whatever you do in the next 2 seconds. So the technique gets quietly filed under things that sound nice in theory, and the old responses come back online by default, the same ones that were never working in the first place. The cost of that conclusion compounds in a specific way. It is not just that one tense meeting goes badly. It is that every high-pressure moment afterward gets treated as proof. The method only works for low-stakes, private discomfort, exactly the moments where you need it at least, and never for the moments where the stakes were high enough to actually matter. There is, however, a real version of this practice built specifically for moments exactly like this one, and it does not require the speed gap to close before it can work. It requires something much smaller, a single move, practiced in advance, small enough to actually fit inside the half-second you are given. Under real pressure, almost everyone defaults to one of 2 moves, and both of them fail for reasons that have nothing to do with character. The first is venting, firing back immediately, correcting the colleague in front of everyone with whatever sentence arrives first, unfiltered. It feels like strength in the moment, and frequently creates a second problem that outlasts the first one, a tone people remember long after they have forgotten who actually had the idea. The damage done by the sentence often outlives the original offense by months. The second default is freezing, swallowing the whole thing, saying nothing, smiling through the rest of the call. This feels like composure, and it is actually the checking trap from the first chapter wearing a professional outfit. The moment does not get processed. It gets filed, unresolved, and replayed at full volume at 2 a.m. 3 days later, with new and worse lines added to what you wish you had said, each replay convincing you a little further that you handled it badly, when what you actually did was postpone the handling entirely. There is a real reason neither move gives you a real third option in the moment itself. Neuroscientists who study fear circuitry have documented that the brain's threat detection center can trigger a full bodily response before the slower, more deliberate part of your brain responsible for weighing options has even finished processing what happened. Popular psychology sometimes calls this an amygdala hijack, and while the phrase oversimplifies the underlying biology, the basic sequence holds up. Your body is already reacting before your more careful thinking has caught up enough to choose anything on purpose. This is not a flaw unique to you. It is the same architecture in everyone on that call, which is part of why nobody seems bothered when a normally composed person takes a visible half-second before responding to something unfair. That half-second is not weakness showing through. It is the only available window for anything other than pure reflex, and it is also the only window the next 3 steps actually need. Knowing this changes what you are actually trying to do in the moment. You are not trying to outthink a process that is faster than thinking. You are trying to survive the half-second that process takes, intact, without doing anything in that window you will need to repair afterward. That is a much smaller and far more achievable target than calm. And it is the only target the speed gap actually leaves available to you. So here is the distinction this chapter needs you to hold on to. A bridge move is not the same as a full cycle. A full cycle, the 4 parts from the last 2 chapters, it takes a minute or more, and was built for moments with room to breathe. A bridge move is something else entirely. A compressed action small enough to fit inside the half-second the speed gap actually gives you, designed only to get you safely past the reflex, not to resolve the whole feeling on the spot. Trying to run the full cycle in real time is what convinces people the method has failed them. It was never meant to run at that speed in the first place. Here is the pressure version, the bridge move, built specifically for moments that give you a second instead of a minute, followed by the full cycle you already know, run later in private. Step 1. The combined check and name in a single breath. Under real pressure, there is no time for two separate analytical steps, so collapse them into one silent phrase. This is the urge to snap back. That single sentence does the job of both the threat check and the naming step from earlier chapters, fast enough to fit inside the half-second you actually have before you are expected to respond. Step 2. The one-breath anchor. Instead of a 90-second sit, which the moment does not allow, take exactly one breath in through your nose and direct your attention to one specific physical point as you do it. Your feet flat on the floor, your hand against the desk, anywhere concrete enough to interrupt the reflex without requiring any extra time you do not have. The breath itself is not decorative. It is the smallest version of the sit and redirect step that still fits inside real time, doing in 1 second what the full version does in 90. Step 3. The bridge sentence, spoken out loud. This is the part that buys you the external time the internal steps cannot provide on their own. A short, neutral, true sentence, said calmly, while the first two steps are already running underneath it. Let me come back to that in a second. Or, I want to make sure I credit this accurately before we move on. The sentence is not a script for being agreeable. It is a true statement that gives your nervous system 2 or 3 more seconds to finish catching up before you say anything else, and it works whether you say it out loud to a colleague or silently to yourself in a moment with no audience at all. Step 4. The full cycle, completed later, in private, the moment an actual free minute exists. This is the part the bridge move was never meant to replace. At lunch, or that evening, run the complete 4-part practice on the meeting itself. The detailed threat check, the name, the full 90-second sit, and the write. Skipping this step and relying only on the bridge move forever starves the system of the complete processing it needs, leaving a string of half-handled moments that never quite finish resolving. Each one technically survived, but never actually closed. The order matters here in a way it has not mattered in earlier chapters. The bridge move is not a smaller, lesser version of the full cycle that you graduate out of once you get good enough. It is a permanent, separate tool for a permanently different kind of moment, used alongside the full cycle rather than in place of it. Real pressure will keep arriving in half-second windows for the rest of your life. The goal is never to eliminate the speed gap. It is to have something specific and practiced, ready to fit inside it every time. The same 4 small motions, rehearsed often enough in low-stakes moments that they are already familiar by the time a high-stakes one arrives without warning. Picture the call again. The heat rises the instant your colleague takes credit for your idea. This is the urge to snap back. One breath, feet flat on the floor. Out loud, calmly. I want to make sure I credit this accurately. Can we come back to that for a second? The meeting moves on. Nobody on the call notices anything beyond a half-second pause and a clarifying sentence. At lunch, alone, you run the full cycle on what actually happened, naming the fear underneath the anger, sitting with it for 90 real seconds, and writing down the number it started at and the number it ended on. Pause now. Write down one recent high-pressure moment where you either snapped or froze, name which one it was, and write the specific bridge sentence you could have used instead, the way it would actually sound coming out of your mouth. You were never failing under pressure because you lacked composure. You were missing a version of the practice built for half a second instead of 90, and the full cycle was always waiting for you on the other side of it, whenever you finally had the room to use it properly, which arrives far sooner than it feels like it will in the moment itself. Chapter 6. The Relationship. Alarm. Why you keep checking if you're still loved. It has been 40 minutes since you sent the text, and the 3 small words at the bottom of the screen still say delivered, not read. You check again anyway. You scroll back up to the message itself, rereading it the way you reread the email in an earlier chapter, looking for the wrong word, the wrong tone,
anything that might explain the silence. Your stomach has tightened into a small, specific knot that has nothing to do with anything that has actually happened, and everything to do with what your mind has already started writing about it. This is the same alarm from every chapter before this one, aimed for the first time at another person, instead of at a thought, a craving, or a fear. Call it the relationship alarm, the moment an ambiguous gap in someone else's behavior, a slow reply, a flat tone, a canceled plan, gets filed in the same emergency folder as everything else this audiobook has been teaching you to recognize. The text has not been read yet. That is the entire fact available to you. The alarm does not deal in facts that small. It needs a story, so it writes one, usually the worst version available, and hands it to you as though it had arrived from somewhere outside your own head. Live with this setting running long enough inside a relationship, and it does something a private internal alarm never could. It reaches outward and starts shaping how the other person experiences being close to you. The checking, the rereading, the gentle but frequent questions about whether everything is okay. All of it eventually registers to a partner not as love, but as surveillance, a quiet, constant audit of a connection that was never actually in danger in the first place. The cruelest part of this pattern is how it defeats its own purpose. The entire function of the checking is to feel reassured, and the checking itself is what prevents reassurance from ever fully landing. Each time the alarm fires and gets answered, even with genuine warmth, the part of you doing the checking learns only that checking gets a response, never that the underlying fear was unfounded. And so the next ambiguous gap arrives just as primed to trigger the exact same search for proof. This rarely stays confined to texts. It shows up in scanning a friend's tone on a call for signs you have done something wrong. It shows up in replaying a brief, slightly flat goodbye from a parent and deciding it meant something it almost certainly did not. It shows up at work, in rereading a manager's two-word reply to an email a dozen times for a hint of disapproval that was never actually there to begin with. Wherever a relationship leaves any gap at all, ordinary, unavoidable gaps that every relationship has, the alarm treats the gap itself as the danger, regardless of who is on the other side of it. The instinct, once the knot in your stomach shows up, is to ask directly, "Are we okay? Did I do something wrong? You seem distant lately. Is everything fine?" These questions feel like communication, even like intimacy, reaching toward the other person instead of away from them. But notice what they are actually built to do. Each one is a request for a specific verdict, delivered now, that proves the alarm wrong on the spot. And a verdict delivered on demand rarely settles anything for long, because the underlying alarm was never actually about the answer to the question being asked. Even a warm, immediate, reassuring answer rarely ends the cycle for good. It buys a few hours of quiet, sometimes a day, before the next gap opens, and the same question arrives again in a slightly different shape. This is not because the partner's reassurance was insincere. It is because reassurance answers the words of the question while leaving the actual alarm underneath it untouched. The same way telling a smoke detector the toast is fine does nothing to recalibrate its sensitivity for next time. The psychiatrist John Bowlby spent decades studying what he called attachment, the deep, early-formed expectations people carry about whether the people closest to them can be relied upon to stay close. He found that people whose attachment style leans anxious tend to interpret ambiguous signals from a partner, exactly the kind of gap a slow reply leaves wide open, as evidence of withdrawal far more readily than the situation actually supports, and respond with heightened monitoring that, over time, often produces the very distance it was trying to prevent. The fear creates the behavior. The behavior strains the bond. The strain gets read as confirmation of the original fear, and the loop tightens by one more turn. None of this means the fear itself is irrational or shameful. It usually traces back to real experiences, somewhere earlier in life, where closeness genuinely was unreliable, and watching closely genuinely mattered. The problem is not that the alarm exists.
The problem is the same one from every earlier chapter. A system calibrated for a different set of circumstances, still running its old settings against a relationship that may not deserve that level of suspicion at all. Ask yourself what it actually tells a partner when reassurance never seems to land, when every answered question is followed, eventually, by a new one. It does not tell them the relationship is loved more carefully than most. It tells them that nothing they say will ever be quite enough, which is exhausting to hear, and even more exhausting to keep saying. And the exhaustion itself becomes a second very real source of distance neither person actually wanted. So here is the distinction this chapter needs you to hold on to. Connection seeking is not the same as reassurance seeking. Connection seeking shares an actual experience, openly, without demanding a specific response that proves anything on the spot. Reassurance seeking demands a particular answer, right now, that makes the alarm stop. And like every other form of checking in this audiobook, the relief it produces resets the loop instead of closing it. One builds the relationship. The other quietly audits it again and again, in a language that sounds like closeness but functions like surveillance. Here is the relational version of the redirection practice, adapted for the specific shape this alarm takes when it is aimed at another person instead of inward. Step 1. The threat check, applied to the gap itself rather than to your reaction to it. Ask plainly, what do I actually know right now, and what am I filling in? A delayed reply is an absence of information, not evidence of anything. The relationship alarm treats the absence as proof. The honest accounting treats it as exactly what it is: a blank space your mind has volunteered to fill with the worst available story. Step 2. The name. This is the relationship alarm, not evidence, said plainly once, the same way you would name any other false alarm by now. Not a denial that something might eventually be wrong, simply an accurate label for what this particular moment actually is. Step 3. The sit and redirect exactly as before. Let the urge to check the phone again sit unanswered for 90 seconds, or use the one-breath bridge version from the last chapter if the urge arrives somewhere you cannot fully step away from. Redirect attention to a specific physical anchor, and let the chemical wave behind the urge run its course, the way it always does when nothing keeps re-triggering it. Checking the phone one more time is, mechanically, identical to checking the sent folder from the second chapter or the urge from the first one. It feels different because another person is involved. It runs on exactly the same circuitry. Step 4. The rewritten request. If after running the first 3 steps, something genuine still feels worth raising with the other person, raise it as connection-seeking rather than reassurance-seeking. Not "Are we okay?" asked in a way that demands an immediate verdict, but a sentence that shares your actual experience without requiring anyone to fix it on the spot. I noticed I started worrying when I didn't hear back right away. I'm not asking you to do anything differently. I just wanted to be honest about where my head went. This sentence invites closeness without auditing it, and it gives the other person room to respond as a partner rather than as a witness being cross-examined. The 4th step is also where the writing ritual from earlier chapters earns its place again. Most of the time, putting the worry on paper first is enough on its own. The act of writing it down plainly in the same notebook the introduction asked you to start often reveals that the worry was smaller and less urgent than it felt while it was still circling unspoken in your head. Only the worries that survive being written down in plain language, the genuinely recurring ones, tend to be worth raising with the other person at all. Picture the message again, still marked delivered, not read. You ask what you actually know. Nothing yet, just a gap. You name it. This is the relationship alarm, not evidence. You let the urge to check sit for 90 seconds, then redirect to the work in front of you. An hour later, a reply finally arrives. Ordinary, unremarkable, exactly nothing like the story the alarm had already written. If the worry had genuinely mattered enough to mention, you would raise it later as your own experience, not as a question demanding proof, and the conversation that follows would be about connection instead of an audit nobody asked for. Run this enough times across enough ordinary gaps, and something changes that has nothing to do with the other person at all. The relationship does not get safer because you have finally extracted enough proof to relax. It gets safer because you have stopped needing the proof in the first place. And a relationship that no longer requires constant verification has far more room left over for the parts that actually make it worth having. Pause now. Write down one recent moment you sought reassurance from someone instead of sharing a genuine experience with them. Name the verdict you were actually trying to extract, and write the connection-seeking version of that same moment. The sentence you could use next time the gap reopens. You were never asking for too much closeness. You were asking the wrong question of the wrong source, demanding that someone else's words turn off an alarm that was never actually about them in the first place.
Chapter 7. The Avoidance Question. What non-resistance actually asks of you. It is past midnight, 3 weeks into using everything this audiobook has taught you, and you are staring at the ceiling instead of sleeping, not because a craving or a fear has shown up, but because a quieter, more unsettling thought has arrived in its place. The cigarette urge passed the other night exactly the way it was supposed to. The fear before the review faded on schedule, and lying here now, none of that feels like the relief it should. A new voice has shown up to replace the old ones. Isn't this just a polite way of running from things? Real strength fights through pain. You have simply gotten good at dodging it. This doubt deserves a name as precise as everything else in this audiobook, because it is doing real work, quietly, in the dark. Call it the avoidance question, and notice what makes it so effective. It does not attack the technique on the grounds that it fails. By now you have watched it work, repeatedly, on real urges and real fears. It attacks on a different front entirely, suggesting that working is itself the problem. That anything which removes discomfort this efficiently must be cheating some unstated rule about what facing your problems is supposed to feel like. Underneath the question sits an old, mostly unexamined assumption that courage and suffering are the same size, that if something did not cost you visible struggle, it could not have been real growth. By that measure, the version of you that white-knuckled through cravings for years, exhausted and miserable, was somehow more virtuous than the version of you redirecting attention calmly tonight, even though the white-knuckling version kept failing, and this one keeps working. This assumption rarely arrives announced as a belief you could examine and reject. It arrives dressed as memory, as the voice of every coach, every relative, every motivational poster that ever equated gritted teeth with character. Nobody sat you down and argued the case that suffering proves sincerity. It accumulated unexamined, the way most inherited rules do, until it felt less like an opinion and more like a fact about how the world works. Left unanswered, this question does something specific and costly. It does not just create a moment of doubt. It builds a quiet case for going back to the old fight, on the theory that struggle itself was the proof of effort, and effort that does not visibly hurt must not be real effort at all. People have abandoned methods that were genuinely working for exactly this reason, trading results for the familiar feeling of suffering nobly instead, mistaking the absence of visible struggle for the absence of any real change happening underneath it. This chapter exists to settle that question once, carefully, so it does not keep reappearing at midnight every few weeks, demanding the same argument all over again. Here is what the avoidance question gets wrong, and it is worth being precise about it, because the word avoidance already has a real, specific meaning in psychology, and what you have been practicing is close to its opposite. Genuine avoidance means restructuring your actual life to prevent contact with a feared experience altogether. It is the person who stops speaking up in meetings entirely so the fear of judgment never gets triggered. It is the smoker who refuses to even consider quitting because thinking about the craving feels unbearable.
It is canceling the date, skipping the gathering, leaving the situation itself, so the underlying feeling never has the chance to arise in the first place. Avoidance shrinks your actual life to protect you from an internal experience, one canceled plan at a time, until the protected territory has grown so large it barely resembles a life at all. What this audiobook has been teaching you is the structural opposite. You did not avoid the cigarette craving. You stood in its presence, named it, and let it run its course while still choosing not to smoke. You did not avoid the performance review. You walked into the room, fear and all, and delivered the update. Staying in full contact with an uncomfortable internal experience while still doing the thing that matters to you is not avoidance by any honest definition. It is closer to the textbook description of facing something directly, the very opposite of what the midnight voice accuses you of. The psychologist Stephen Hayes built an entire framework around this exact distinction, calling the capacity to stay present with discomfort while still acting on what actually matters to you psychological flexibility. Hayes found that people who tried to eliminate or escape uncomfortable internal experience, what his research calls experiential avoidance, tended to suffer more over time and narrow their lives further, while people who learned to stay in contact with the discomfort, without either fighting it or fleeing the situation producing it, reported greater functioning even when the discomfort itself never fully disappeared. This is the part worth sitting with for a moment. The discomfort in Hayes's findings did not need to vanish for someone's life to expand again. What mattered was whether the person kept fleeing from it or learned to stay in the room with it. That single shift, staying versus fleeing, predicted more about someone's actual functioning than the raw intensity of the feeling itself ever did, which is a far more useful and far less dramatic finding than most popular advice on the subject lets on. So here is the distinction underneath everything this audiobook has built so far, the one that finally resolves the avoidance question for good. Mystical surrender is not the same as mechanical non-resistance. Mystical surrender asks you to trust a cosmic principle, to believe that release works because the universe rewards letting go, a leap of faith you either have or do not. Mechanical non-resistance asks for none of that. It is a specific, repeatable technique with a documented mechanism, exactly as demanding as fighting, just aimed in a different direction, at staying present rather than at suppressing. And it works whether you believe in anything beyond your own nervous system or not. Here is a direct way to settle the avoidance question for yourself, anytime it resurfaces, instead of arguing with it in the abstract at midnight. Run what you can call the effort audit, a short test you can apply in seconds whenever the question resurfaces. Ask one specific question about whatever you are doing. Am I changing what I do? Or am I changing how I relate to what I feel while doing the exact same thing? If the honest answer involves canceling a plan, leaving a room, skipping a conversation, or restructuring your actual life to dodge the trigger entirely, that is avoidance. And this audiobook has never asked that of you. If the honest answer involves staying exactly where you were, doing exactly what you intended to do, while simply declining to fight the internal noise underneath it, that is non-resistance, and it is not the easier option. It is the harder one, because it requires staying present with something uncomfortable, instead of escaping it. The audit works precisely because it asks about behavior rather than feeling. Feelings are not reliable evidence here, because non-resistance can feel calm from the outside while still asking something real of you on the inside, and avoidance can feel like relief in the short term while quietly costing you a larger and larger share of your actual life. Behavior does not lie the way a feeling can. Either you stayed in the room or you left it. Either you delivered the update or you found a reason not to. The audit only needs that one fact to settle the question. Apply the audit to the cigarette scene from the first chapter. Did you avoid anything? No. You stood in the kitchen, the urge fully present, named it, let it sit for 90 seconds and did not smoke. You stayed in contact with the craving for longer, not less, than someone white-knuckling through it while desperately trying not to think about it at all. The white-knuckling version was the one doing the avoiding, frantically trying to escape an internal sensation through sheer denial. The version you actually practiced stayed present the entire time. Apply it again to the performance review from the 3rd chapter. Avoidance would have looked like calling in sick or asking someone else to deliver the update, or rehearsing reassurance so heavily that you never actually let yourself feel the fear at all. What you did instead was walk into the room with the fear fully intact, present and accounted for, and deliver the update anyway. That is not the absence of courage. That is what courage actually requires, stripped of the assumption that it has to look like visible suffering to count. Notice, too, that the bridge move from the pressure chapter passes the same audit without trouble. Pausing for one breath before responding to a colleague is not avoidance of the conflict. You are still in the room, still addressing the situation, still planning to raise the issue properly later. You have simply declined to let the first half-second of reflex make the decision for you. The audit does not penalize a pause. It only penalizes leaving the room entirely. This reframing matters beyond settling an argument with yourself at midnight. It changes what you are allowed to feel proud of. You are not permitted to feel proud only when something hurt enough to prove your effort. You are permitted to feel proud when you stayed present with something difficult and acted on what mattered anyway, regardless of how calm the outside of that moment happened to look to anyone watching, including you. The midnight voice measures effort by volume. The effort audit measures it by contact. And contact, it turns out, is the only measurement that has ever actually predicted whether someone's life gets larger or smaller over time. Pause now. Write down one recent moment the avoidance question showed up for you. Name exactly what you actually did in that moment, and run the effort audit on it honestly, in writing, the way an outside observer would describe what they actually saw you do. Non-resistance was never the easy way out. It was simply the way that finally stopped costing you the same fight twice, once in the moment, and once again afterward, convincing yourself the moment never should have felt as manageable as it did, and that the manageable feeling was somehow evidence against you instead of proof the practice had quietly done its job.
Chapter 8. The Reset. Illusion. Why 1 bad night doesn't erase 8 good weeks. It has been 8 weeks since the redirection practice turned smoking from a daily fight into something you barely had to think about anymore. The notebook by your bed has rows of small numbers, 8s dropping to 4s, 6s dropping to 2s. An entire quiet record of a problem that used to run your evenings and now mostly does not. Then your father calls with news about his diagnosis, and 3 hours later you are standing on the back porch with a cigarette between your fingers, lit, half gone, before you have even fully registered deciding to do it. The cigarette itself is not the dangerous part of this moment. What happens in the next 60 seconds is, standing there, smoke still in your lungs, a single sentence arrives with the force of a verdict. 8 weeks. Gone, just like that. You are right back where you started. Call this the reset illusion. The belief that a single lapse does not simply happen alongside 8 weeks of progress, but actively erases it. The way a finger swept across a chalkboard erases a calculation, leaving nothing behind to show the work was ever done. Notice what the reset illusion is actually claiming, because the claim does not survive examination. It says that the 90-second sits, the threat checks, the months of practice that quieted hundreds of smaller urges were never real, were only ever a temporary trick that one hard night has now exposed as fake. This is not how skills work in any other part of life. A pianist who misses a passage during a recital after years of practice has not unlearned the piano. A single lapse on a porch after devastating news has not unlearned 8 weeks of a documented, working technique either. What makes the reset illusion so dangerous is what it tends to produce next.
not the cigarette itself, but the response to having smoked it. Convinced the work is undone, people in this exact moment often stop doing the only thing that was actually working, abandoning the practice entirely on the theory that a method this fragile must not have been worth continuing. And within days, the old pattern, suppression and checking and white-knuckling, quietly moves back into the space the practice had been holding for 2 months. This is the part almost nobody warns you about when they describe a method working. They show you the 8 good weeks. They rarely mention the night the news arrives, the funeral, the diagnosis, the layoff, the moment large enough to overwhelm even a well-practiced response, because that moment is not a sign anything went wrong with the method. It is simply the moment every maintenance chapter in every real account of lasting change eventually has to address. And most people meet it with no preparation at all, having assumed 8 good weeks meant the hard part was permanently finished. Here is the uncomfortable fact underneath this entire chapter. The old pattern was never actually deleted. It was set aside, outcompeted by a better option for 8 straight weeks. But the underlying pathway, the years of practice your nervous system put into reaching for a cigarette under stress, did not get erased the way a habit tracker resets to 0. Under severe enough pressure, devastating news arriving without warning, that older, more practiced pathway can still fire, simply because it had more repetitions behind it over a lifetime than 8 weeks of something new could possibly outweigh on its own. This is not a flaw in the redirection practice. It is how change actually works in a nervous system that does not delete old material just because newer material has been winning lately. Knowing this in advance changes what a lapse means. It stops being proof the method failed and becomes exactly what it actually is: evidence that an old, well-worn pathway can still activate under extreme enough pressure, which was always going to be true regardless of which technique you were using. The researcher Alan Marlatt spent much of his career studying exactly this moment, the hours immediately following a single lapse in someone trying to change a deeply practiced behavior. He documented something he called the abstinence violation effect. People who interpreted one lapse as proof of total failure were significantly more likely to spiral into a full, sustained return to the old pattern than people who treated the same lapse as a single, isolated event inside an otherwise improving trend. The cigarette on the porch did not decide what happened next. The sentence that followed it did. What makes the abstinence violation effect so easy to fall into is that the verdict feels like honesty rather than distortion, in exactly the same way the all-or-nothing voice did back in the 4th chapter. Nobody standing on that porch experiences the thought 8 weeks, gone as an exaggeration. It feels like finally seeing the truth after weeks of cautious optimism, when in fact it is the oldest trick this entire pattern has, dressing up a single data point as a complete and final verdict on everything that came before it. Ask yourself what actually changed in the 60 seconds after you lit that cigarette. Nothing about your body, your history, or your 8 weeks of progress was altered by the smoke itself. The only thing that changed was the verdict you handed yourself, and the verdict, not the cigarette, is what determines whether tomorrow looks like a return to the practice or a slow drift back into the old fight. So here is the distinction this chapter needs you to hold on to, the one that finally separates a setback from a collapse. A lapse is not the same as a relapse. A lapse is a single, isolated slip, one cigarette, one suppressed evening, one night. The old pattern won, that says nothing on its own about the days surrounding it. A relapse is a sustained return to the old pattern over time. And a relapse only happens because a lapse got reinterpreted as a verdict, and the practice got abandoned in response. The cigarette was a lapse. Whether it becomes a relapse depends entirely on what you do in the next 24 hours, not on what already happened on the porch. Here is the lapse protocol, the complete maintenance procedure for the moment after a slip, built to stop a lapse from quietly becoming a relapse. Step 1. Name the event factually, the same way you have been naming thoughts and fears throughout this audiobook. Not "I've ruined everything," which is a verdict, but one cigarette on the porch after difficult news, which is a fact with a beginning and an end. Facts are containable. Verdicts metastasize into a story about your entire character, and only one of those two things is actually true. Step 2. Resume the practice on the very next trigger immediately, without waiting for a symbolic fresh start. Do not wait for Monday. Do not wait until you feel ready again, or until some imagined clean slate arrives to make starting over feel official. Marlett's research is specific on this point. The gap between a lapse and the next attempt is the single most important window in the entire process, and people who wait for the right moment to resume usually find that the right moment keeps receding the longer they wait, while people who simply run the next threat check on the next urge that same day rarely experience the lapse as anything more than what it actually was. Waiting itself is what manufactures the relapse, far more often than the original lapse ever does on its own. Step 3. Write the lapse down with the same honesty you have been bringing to every number in your notebook so far. What triggered it? What the intensity was before? What actually happened? What you will do differently on the next trigger, specifically, not in general terms. This is not a confession. It is data. The same kind of data that turned 8 weeks of partial results into 8 weeks of real progress in the first place. And data about a lapse is exactly as useful as data about a success, sometimes more so. Step 4. Identify what the lapse actually reveals about maintenance, not about character. A lapse during a moment of severe, unexpected stress often reveals that the practice had quietly become something you only reached for automatically during ordinary days, with no deliberate plan for the extraordinary ones. Build that plan now, specifically. Decide, in writing, what the very first move will be the next time genuinely devastating news arrives, before it arrives, so the next crisis meets a plan instead of an empty space where the old pattern is free to walk back in uncontested. A practice that only runs on autopilot during easy weeks was never finished being built in the first place, and a lapse is simply the moment that fact became visible. Picture the porch again. The cigarette is half gone, the news is still settling in your chest, and this time the sentence that arrives is different. One cigarette after devastating news is a lapse, not a verdict. You finish it without adding a second one on top of it through sheer momentum. And an hour later, when the next urge for a second cigarette arrives, you run the threat check exactly as you have for 2 months. You write down what happened plainly in the notebook before bed. What triggered it? The intensity before. What you actually did. And one specific change for next time. 8 weeks of progress are still there in the morning, exactly where they were, because nothing about them was ever actually contingent on tonight going perfectly. None of the 4 steps require you to feel calm about the lapse while you are still standing on the porch. They only require you to run them in order, the same way the redirection practice never required you to feel optimistic before it started working. The feeling can arrive later, once the data on the page has made its own case, slowly, the way it always has throughout this audiobook. Pause now. Write down one recent lapse in any change you have been working on. Name honestly whether you treated it as a single fact or escalated it into a verdict about yourself, and write the specific first move you will make the next time a genuinely hard night arrives, decided now, while you are calm enough to decide it well. You were never 1 cigarette away from being back at the start. You were 1 sentence away from deciding whether 8 real weeks counted for anything, and that sentence was always yours to write differently. Chapter 9. The Identity Lag. Why the old label outlasts the old behavior. A friend asks if you want to grab a drink after the kind of day you used to spend white-knuckling through one craving after another, and the sentence arrives in your mouth before you have any chance to check it. Oh, you know me, I'm just an anxious person. I'll probably be a wreck about it later. You hear yourself say it and something does not line up. You have not actually been a wreck about anything in 9 weeks. The notebook on your nightstand has the numbers to prove it. And yet the sentence came out smooth and automatic,
exactly the way it always has, as though none of the last 9 weeks had happened at all. This is not dishonesty. It is something more specific and more interesting. The identity lag, the gap between what your behavior has actually become and what your self-description has gotten around to updating. Behavior can change in weeks.
The sentence you reach for to describe yourself to a friend, formed over years of repetition, on a much slower clock entirely, often keeps running on its old script long after the evidence underneath it has shifted, simply because nobody has gone back and rewritten the script on purpose. Notice what is actually happening when that old sentence comes out. You are not lying. You are reporting an identity that used to be true. The same way an old address still feels like home for a while after you have moved, even though nobody actually lives there anymore. The label is not malicious. It is just outdated, running entirely on inertia. Repeated because it has always been repeated, not because anyone checked whether it still matches what is currently true. The lag shows up in smaller moments too, not just at the bar. It shows up in the way you still flinch slightly when someone mentions cigarettes around you, bracing for a craving that, these days, mostly does not arrive. It shows up in the careful, apologetic tone you still use when declining a smoke break, as though you were managing a fragile condition rather than simply living as someone who does not smoke anymore. None of these moments are dramatic on their own. Together, they describe a person still narrating themselves according to a draft that 9 real weeks of evidence has already quietly replaced. Left unexamined, the identity lag does something more than create an awkward mismatch at happy hour. It leaves a script sitting loaded and ready for the next hard moment. A sentence that, the instant something does go wrong, a single lapse, a rough week, slides right back into place and announces itself as the truth. See, I really am an anxious person. I knew this wouldn't last. The old identity never replaced is always standing by, waiting for one bad night to reclaim the microphone.
Here is why simply repeating the redirection practice, even successfully for weeks at a time, does not automatically rewrite the sentence on its own. Behavior and self-concept run on separate systems, and one does not update the other for free just because enough time has passed. The psychologist Leon Festinger documented what happens when a person's actions and their self-concept stop matching, a state he called cognitive dissonance. He found that the mind strongly prefers consistency between what it believes about itself and what it actually does, and when the two diverge, something has to move to close the gap. Most people assume the behavior will simply update the belief over time. Festinger's research suggests the reverse is just as likely, sometimes more likely. The mind quietly pulls behavior back toward the existing self-concept, because reverting a few weeks of new behavior is, to the part of the brain managing consistency, often a smaller adjustment than rewriting years of accumulated identity. This explains something that otherwise looks like pure self-sabotage. A person who has been doing well for weeks, with no obvious trigger in sight, sometimes manufactures a small crisis, or lets an old habit creep back in for no apparent reason. It rarely looks deliberate from the inside. It looks like things just slipping. What is actually happening, more often than not, is dissonance quietly resolving itself in the direction of least resistance, restoring the older, more deeply rehearsed story about who this person has always been. This is the part that explains why a lapse can feel disproportionately dangerous even after the lapse protocol from the last chapter has already drained most of its power. A lapse is not just a single event anymore. It is an opening, a moment the old unrevised identity has been waiting for, ready to reassert itself the instant the new behavior stumbles even slightly. Precisely because nobody ever formally retired the old sentence in the first place. James Clear's research into habit formation describes something closely related. Every action functions as a small vote for the kind of person you believe yourself to be, and identity shifts not through any single dramatic decision, but through the accumulation of those votes over time. 9 weeks of running the redirection practice are 9 weeks of votes already cast.
The problem is not that the votes have not been counted. The problem is that nobody has gone back and updated the sentence those votes were actually voting for, leaving an accurate ledger attached to an outdated headline. So here is the distinction this chapter needs you to hold on to. Behavior change is not the same as identity change. Behavior change means doing something differently, which you have already been doing for 9 real weeks. Identity change means becoming the kind of person for whom that different behavior is simply normal, no longer a special effort being maintained against the grain of who you secretly believe yourself to still be. Behavior without an updated identity stays fragile, vulnerable to the dissonance pull described above. Behavior with an updated identity becomes self-reinforcing because it finally matches the sentence you actually tell yourself about who you are. Here is the identity update, the complete procedure for closing the gap between your behavior and your self-description on purpose, rather than leaving it to dissonance to close it for you, badly, in the wrong direction. Step 1. Collect the evidence you have already gathered without realizing it was evidence. Open the notebook, the numbers, the 8s dropping to 4s, the laps written down honestly instead of catastrophized, the bridge sentences used in real meetings. All of it is documentation of a person who already behaves differently than the old label describes. Identity does not update well on aspiration alone, it updates on evidence, and you have 9 weeks of it sitting in a drawer by your bed, dated, specific, and far harder to argue with than any feeling you might have about yourself on a given evening. Step 2. Write a new identity sentence built directly from that evidence, not from how you wish you felt. Not "I am calm," which is a feeling, and will fluctuate by the hour regardless of anything you do. Something specific and falsifiable instead. I am someone who runs the redirection practice when an urge shows up. This sentence is not a hope. It is a description of something you have now done, accurately, dozens of times, with a notebook full of dates to prove it whenever the old voice tries to argue otherwise. A sentence this specific cannot be argued away by one bad evening, because it was never claiming to predict every evening in the first place, only to describe what you actually do when an urge arrives. Step 3. Deploy the new sentence at the exact moment the old one tries to speak first, which is the only moment that actually matters. The next time a friend asks how you are doing and "oh, you know me, I'm just an anxious person" starts forming automatically, catch it mid-sentence the same way you have been catching urges since the first chapter, and substitute the evidence-based version instead. I've actually got a practice for this now, and it's been working. This is not a performance for the friend's benefit. It is a vote, cast on purpose, in the exact moment that used to belong entirely to the old script by default. This third step matters more than it looks like it should, because identity is not updated by private conviction alone. It is updated by repetition, in real moments, with real witnesses. The same way the original identity was built through years of repeating the old sentence to other people without ever once examining it. The new sentence needs the same kind of practice the old one got for free. And every ordinary conversation where you catch yourself mid-script is another small repetition working in the new sentence's favor. None of this requires announcing the change as a project to anyone. Most of these substitutions will happen quietly. In conversations nobody else even notices have shifted. That is, if anything, a better sign than a dramatic announcement would be. An identity that is actually changed does not need to be declared. It simply starts showing up, unremarked, in the small sentences you reach for without thinking, the same way the old one once did. Picture the bar again. The old sentence starts forming, "Oh, you know me." This time you catch it before it finishes. The same threat check reflex from every earlier chapter, now aimed at your own self-description instead of an external trigger. You say instead, plainly, "I've actually had a good few weeks with this. Turns out there's a real technique for it. Nothing about the moment is dramatic. Nobody at the table notices anything beyond an ordinary answer to an ordinary question. but the identity sitting underneath it has just been updated, on purpose, in real time, instead of being left to drift back toward whatever it used to be by default. Pause now. Write down the old identity sentence you have been reaching for automatically, and write the evidence-based sentence your own notebook actually supports, built from real numbers and real dates, rather than from how confident you happen to feel reading it back tonight. You were never just an anxious person, a craving-driven person, or any other label that came first and the behavior simply followed. You were always someone whose behavior the label had not caught up to yet, and the catching up was always going to be a sentence you had to write yourself, on purpose, since nobody else was ever going to write it for you, and no amount of waiting was going to make it write itself.
Chapter 10. The Quiet Mind. Who You Become When the War Finally Ends. It is an ordinary Tuesday. 4 months after the night you stood on the back porch with a cigarette half gone between your fingers, and something happens that would have been unthinkable at the start of this audiobook. You are sitting in traffic, late for something that actually matters, and a familiar tightness starts to rise in your chest. And then, almost before you notice it arriving, it is already passing. No internal alarm, no frantic reach for a script. No identity crisis about what this moment says about who you are. Just a brief, ordinary wave of tension, met, handled, gone, the way weather passes over a window without anyone needing to comment on it. This is the thing nobody told you to expect at the beginning, because it cannot be described in advance without sounding like an empty promise. The goal was never to reach a state where nothing difficult ever arises again. Cravings still show up. Fear still tightens your chest before something important. The relationship alarm still occasionally fires over an ordinary silence. What has actually changed is not the frequency of these events. It is what happens in the half-second after they arrive. And that half-second, repeated enough times across enough ordinary days, has rebuilt something much larger than any single technique could account for on its own. Think back to the person standing in the kitchen in the first chapter, hand drifting toward a jacket pocket, jaw clenched, telling a craving to leave through sheer command. That person was running alone, on the only tool willpower ever provided, fighting a battle the white bear effect had already rigged against them before it even began. The traffic today is the same nervous system, the same basic wiring, encountering the same basic category of discomfort. What sits between those two moments is not a different person. It is 10 chapters of accumulated practice, run enough times that what once required a deliberate, effortful sequence now happens close to automatically, the way any skill eventually stops feeling like a skill and starts feeling like simply who you are. This does not mean the practice has become invisible or unnecessary. It means it has become quiet. The way a language learned fluently no longer requires conscious translation in your head before you speak it. The mechanism is still running underneath every calm Tuesday. It has simply gotten fast enough and familiar enough that you have stopped needing to watch it work, the same way you no longer narrate to yourself the act of walking down a familiar staircase, even though your body is still doing real, coordinated work to get you down it safely. There is a temptation, looking back from here, to credit a single dramatic insight for all of this, some turning point that explains everything that followed. The truth is less cinematic and more useful. Nothing about this transformation happened in one moment. It happened across hundreds of small mechanical repetitions, 90 seconds at a time, each one nearly identical to the one before it, none of them individually remarkable. If there had been a single dramatic insight, it would have been easy to lose. Insights fade. A specific memory of one good night on a porch, or one calm conference call, eventually blurs into the general texture of a life and stops feeling like proof of anything. What does not fade nearly as easily is a method, run hundreds of times, written down hundreds of times, in a notebook that still exists and can still be opened on a hard day to settle any argument
the old voice tries to start. This matters because it changes how you should think about whatever comes next. After this audiobook ends, and there is no more chapter waiting to introduce the following piece of the mechanism. The redirection practice from the third chapter did not stop being the foundation once the later chapters arrived. The bridge move for real-time pressure did not replace it. The lapse protocol did not retire it. Every later chapter was built directly on top of the ones before it, the way a house is built on a foundation rather than instead of one. And the foundation has been doing quiet, unglamorous work underneath every single chapter since the first one. Psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi spent decades studying what happens when a skill becomes so practiced that it stops requiring conscious effort to execute, a state he associated with the deepest, most sustainable kind of engagement people experience in their work and their lives. The mechanics that once needed careful, deliberate attention, naming a thought, counting to 90, choosing a physical anchor, eventually compress into something closer to instinct, freeing up the attention that effortful technique used to require for whatever actually matters in the moment instead. His research offers a useful warning alongside its promise. The compression into instinct only happens through accumulated repetition, never through understanding the mechanism alone. Reading these 10 chapters carefully is not the same as having run the redirection practice hundreds of times across real cravings, real fears, and real ordinary Tuesdays. The understanding was always meant to be a map. The repetition was always meant to be the actual territory. This is the real shape of what people are reaching for when they talk about surrender, the actual mechanism behind a word that has spent years wrapped in vague spiritual language with no explanation attached. Not a single dramatic letting go, but thousands of small mechanical ones, repeated until the letting go itself stops requiring effort, and simply becomes how this particular nervous system has learned to meet discomfort. The paradox named at the very start of this audiobook resolves here. Plainly, fighting a thought directly made it stronger, every single time, while choosing again and again not to fight it, eventually made the fighting itself unnecessary. There is no new technique in this final chapter, and there does not need to be one. What remains is integration, seeing the entire mechanism as one connected system instead of 10 separate lessons, so it keeps working long after this particular audiobook has ended. The foundation is the redirection practice itself. Name the thought without banning it. Let it sit for a counted window without fighting or feeding it. Redirect attention to something specific and physical, and write down what happened. Every other chapter is a variation built to handle a specific shape this same basic motion has to take. The smoke detector recalibration teaches you to downgrade a false alarm before redirecting. The bridge move compresses the entire sequence into a single breath when real time refuses to give you 90 seconds. The relational version aims the same 4 parts outward at another person, instead of inward at a private thought. None of these are separate systems competing for your attention. They are one system, the same 4 motions, reshaped for different terrain. It can help even now to say the whole arc back to yourself in order, once, the way you might review a map before a long drive you already know well. Notice the thought instead of fighting it. Recalibrate the alarm before responding to it. Compress the practice when time refuses to give you a full minute. Aim the same motions at another person when the alarm fires outward instead of inward. Measure a partial result instead of grading it. Treat a lapse as a fact instead of a verdict. Update the sentence instead of letting the old one speak first. 10 chapters, one continuous shape. Never 10 separate tools competing for space in the same toolbox. The maintenance layer matters just as much as the original technique, and it deserves to be named plainly here at the end. The all-or-nothing voice will keep showing up after a partial result, and the response is still the effort audit, a measurement instead of a verdict. A lapse will eventually happen again, because it always eventually does, and the response is still the lapse protocol, a fact instead of a catastrophe. The old identity will keep trying to speak first in unguarded moments, and the response is still the evidence-based sentence, repeated until it becomes the automatic one, instead of the old script reclaiming the microphone by default. Together, these maintenance pieces exist for a single reason. The foundation will be tested repeatedly by exactly the kind of moments this audiobook has described throughout, and a foundation that only holds during easy weeks was never finished being built. The maintenance layer is what lets the foundation survive contact with an actual life, instead of only ever functioning inside a quiet, controlled, hypothetical version of one. What changes from here forward is not the mechanism. It is the relationship between you and the discomfort the mechanism was always built to meet. Discomfort is not the enemy this audiobook ever asked you to defeat. It was never going to disappear, and chasing its disappearance was always the trap the first chapter described. The guard posted at a door that should never have needed guarding in the first place. What you have actually built, across 10 chapters and however many real nights of practice, is the capacity to stay present with discomfort without needing it to leave before you can function, which turns out to be the only kind of peace that was ever actually available to anyone. Picture the traffic again, the tightness rising and passing, unremarkable, almost forgettable by the time you reach wherever you were already late to. There is no dramatic moment here to narrate, no clean before and after with a visible line drawn between them. There is only an ordinary Tuesday, handled the way ordinary Tuesdays are now handled, by a nervous system that finally stopped needing to win a fight it was never actually capable of winning in the first place. Pause now. For the last time, this audiobook will ask it of you. Write down one moment from the last week where something that once would have triggered the old fight passed instead, quietly, almost without your noticing it had happened at all. And write what that moment tells you about how far the practice has already carried you, whether or not you ever stopped to measure it until just now. You were never trying to win a war against your own mind. You were trying to stop needing one. And somewhere across these 10 chapters, one ordinary, unremarkable Tuesday at a time, you already have, even on the days you were too busy living your life to notice it happening. Conclusion. The closed loop. What was true all along? At the very start of this audiobook, a sentence was planted that was not supposed to make sense yet. The instinct telling you to fight harder is the same instinct keeping the thing alive. 10 chapters later, that sentence no longer needs explaining. You have watched it play out in a kitchen, in a sent email, in a hallway outside a conference room, in a bedroom at 11 at night, in a porch after devastating news, and in a sentence reaching automatically for an old identity at a bar. The instinct to fight was never the solution standing between you and relief. It was the mechanism manufacturing the very thing it claimed to be defeating, every single time, in every single chapter. Think back to that first image, the thought returning the 11th time before midnight, the hand reaching for a phone to drown it out with anything else available, the silent door slammed shut on it 40 seconds before it walked right back in, slightly louder than before. None of that was a character flaw. It was a guard, posted at a door that should never have needed guarding, doing exactly what guards do, keeping watch on the very thing it had been told to keep out, and in doing so, keeping it perpetually present instead. Here, finally, is the entire mechanism in one place, the complete sequence, with nothing held back and nothing left for later. When an unwanted thought, craving, or fear arrives, name it plainly, without command or denial. This is the urge for a cigarette. This is fear about the review. This is the relationship alarm, not evidence. Naming replaces the guard at the door with simple observation. And observation, unlike suppression, requires no monitor standing watch over the very thing it is trying not to think about. This single move, small as it sounds, is the hinge the entire white bear effect turns on. The difference between a thought that gets fed by vigilance and a thought that simply gets acknowledged and allowed to be what it is. Let it sit, fully present for a counted window, neither fought nor fed. 90 seconds when you have the room. One breath and a bridge sentence when you do not. The window is not a punishment and not a denial. It is the space in which a chemical wave that was always going to fade on its own gets the chance to actually do so, undisturbed by a fresh round of resistance restarting it from the top. This is the part most advice on this subject skips entirely, offering acceptance as a slogan instead of a timed, repeatable action with a beginning and an end. Redirect attention to something specific and physical, concrete enough to actually hold focus. The weight of a blanket, the temperature of a door handle, the pressure of feet against a floor. Vague redirection fails. Specific redirection gives the mind somewhere real to stand once it has stopped circling the original alarm. This is the step that finally distinguishes redirection from the white-knuckled denial it so easily gets mistaken for. The step that lets you walk quietly away from a fire instead of standing there insisting it was never burning. Write down what happened in plain language the moment a free minute exists. Not because the writing is decoration on top of the technique, but because writing is, on its own, part of what finishes the work redirection starts, turning a passing internal shift into a recorded fact your nervous system can actually file as resolved. The notebook by your bed, filled with small numbers and short, honest sentences across these 10 chapters, was never a side project running alongside the real work. It was the real work, made visible, one entry at a time. This is the entire mechanism, 4 motions, reshaped across 10 chapters to meet a craving, a fear, a false alarm, a moment with no time to spare, another person's silence, a partial result, a lapse, an outdated sentence about who you are. Not 10 different techniques. One technique, worn in 10 different places, the way a single key can open 10 different doors built to the same lock. None of this required you to believe in anything beyond your own nervous system. It never asked for faith in a cosmic principle, never demanded the mystical leap that surrounds most advice on this subject. It asked only that you test a specific, repeatable, documented mechanism against your own experience, 90 seconds at a time, and let the results speak for themselves, the way they have been speaking quietly, across every chapter since the first one. The paradox named in this audiobook's very title resolves here, with nothing more to add. Fighting an unwanted thought directly is the one move guaranteed to keep it alive, because the fighting itself requires keeping the thought active enough to fight. Non-resistance, used correctly, starves what resistance was feeding, not through magic and not through belief, but through a documented mechanism discovered by accident in a laboratory decades ago, by a researcher asking people not to think about a white bear. You did not need to become a different person to make any of this work. You needed only to do something different the next time a thought arrived uninvited, and then to do it again and again until the doing stopped requiring deliberate effort and simply became how you meet discomfort now. The transformation was never going to announce itself with fanfare. It was always going to arrive the way it actually did, in an ordinary moment in traffic on an ordinary Tuesday, almost too quiet to notice until you stopped to look back and measure the distance. Somewhere between that first urge in a kitchen and this final sentence, something else happened too. Quieter than the technique itself, but just as real. You stopped needing every difficult feeling to mean something was wrong with you. A craving became a craving. Nothing more, nothing requiring a verdict about your character. A racing heart became a chemical wave with a known shape and a known fade, nothing requiring a story about weakness. That shift, from treating discomfort as an emergency to treating it as simply discomfort, may turn out to matter more over the years than any single technique inside it. There is nothing more held back for another audiobook, another chapter, another piece of advice waiting somewhere else. What you needed to handle the next thought, craving, or fear that arrives uninvited, you already have, in full, written down in your own notebook, in your own handwriting, Test it against your own real nights, rather than taken on anyone else's word. The war was never winnable by fighting harder. It was only ever endable by fighting less, in exactly the precise and mechanical way this audiobook has now shown you in its entirety. From the first urge in a kitchen to the last quiet breath in traffic. A top Audiobooks original.